This is a thank you card for Mr. Park. I got started new. If you want to open to Daniel 7, we'll be there in a minute. Daniel chapter 7. Couple of announcements. Miss Barbara brought a card, and I've started over here with Janet. We're going to pass it around. It's a thank you card for Mr. Bart for the flooring and all that stuff, and saving us a pretty decent pile of money. I don't know exactly what that number is, but substantial. So just Miss Barbara's way of us saying thank you. This is Kevin's fault. Where's he at? He's not even in here for me to throw under the bus. Oh, I wasn't here Wednesday, but they said it was pretty good noise outside when the air conditioner was going, and that was in the air conditioner. That's a small piece of concrete, so I'm sure it's Kevin's fault. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's. I want to make sure you got the full blame, so we actually delayed a little bit to make sure you could.
The noise is inside.
Yeah. Stella is home, not feeling well this morning. Be mindful of her. The Bembreys have COVID and are about to go on vacation, so I don't know how that works. But I think Scott said he was going to leave them in the basement at the River House. But they're recovering from that. I think he got it first and then gave it to Opal, but they're both kind of trying to recover. So they called and let me know that yesterday. Grandma is here. Are you going to be called Grandma? What are you going to be called? Who knows? Who knows? Well. That's exactly right. That's whatever the baby. Can I read your quote yesterday? What you texted me, just for other people to relate to. She says, "Gosh, what a feeling to hold your baby's baby." Anybody else relate to that one this morning? Amen. So that's man, we're proud for y'all. I was almost tear to my eyes, proud for you that went well. What was the length? It's Brinley is her name. Length and weight and all that nonsense. Okay. Ooh, long. Good night. Okay. Well, and Mama was in labor about 10 hours, but as far as everything went pretty smooth. And are they home yet? Today. Okay. Well, thank you. And Jaylee texted me and said, kind of thank you for the prayers. And she said, thanking God for the answered prayers on her and Spencer's behalf. So I thought that was pretty cool as well. And then other good news, I said, we'll not re-announce all this later, but in the middle of a thunderstorm, Addison Bethea got baptized yesterday afternoon at the Bill and Lori's swimming pool. And I'll just tell y'all the fuller story, but I mean, y'all, it was storming like cloud to ground lightning at my house, and I was trying to text her like, hey, we might need to put this off for a couple hours, or we might need to like at least go to the church building. And she's like, no, I think we're whatever. And then we got there, and I heard Bill trying to tell her to go to the church building. I heard her dad trying to tell her to go to the church building. She's like, I'm here, I'm ready. And even in the video, you can hear the thunder cracking in the background, but she was ready and determined.
Flash behind
Yeah, like right as we went into the water. But she was determined. So I'm proud for her and of her. So thought I'd share that good news as well. So we had new creation is going to be kind of what's in the sermon today, and that's strongly on my brain from 2 Corinthians 5. So it's good stuff. What other announcements do we need to make before we maybe either update Kevin's list or renew anything on Kevin's list? Anything come up Wednesday that I didn't know about or update, or anybody we want to add? I do want to say, just keep in front of your mind Miss Jan and kind of her scenario. And like I said, she just said pain relief side of hospice coming to try to give her some relief. Let's be mindful of her and what she's got going on. Yes, ma'am?
I had to call him, just texted him, said that Robert was not feeling well, so here.
All right, so let's remember Mr. Robert and Miss Ida as well. Anything else before we get rolling this morning? make sure they're not updated right there. You good? You caught a fish lately, Mr. Oscar? One fish? Two fish? Red fish, blue fish? Two? Just two? All right. Mr. Mark, can I pick on you to kick us off before we get rolling this morning?
Let's all pray. Lord, we thank you for this day you've given us. Lord, we thank you that we can come here and worship you once again. Lord, we want to thank you for all the answered prayers. Lord, we have lifted up quite a few to you lately. Lord, we just ask that you continue to be with all those that's on our prayer list. Lord, we thank you for Addison and pray that all of us will be good examples for her. Lord, we just thank you for all the many blessings that you give us. Thank you for your love and your grace and your mercy. I ask that you be with all the teachers this morning as they stand before us and bring a lesson that we can take it all in and apply it to our life. Pray all these things in Jesus' holy name. Amen.
Amen. I need you guys to be thankful for me. Like that's a good start, right? That I turned off my inner Bible nerd and tried to condense this class into one class and not make this its own entire study, because the Between the Testaments could literally be its own entire study. And so I had to, as much as possible, turn off that inner nerd and not chase every rabbit and jump in every hole that I felt like jumping in. And I know, and you're the only other guy in here that would say that. But let me just kind of, last Sunday, we kind of ended Malachi, and I want to go into a life of Christ study. I'm not going to pick just one gospel. I want to kind of hit high spots from all of them, but it just kind of made sense that Malachi, he's the last prophetic word before we get to John the Baptist, the voice crying in the wilderness. And we've got a little over 400 years of silence. Nehemiah is the last historical book. And what's the significant thing that Nehemiah is part of? Ezra and Nehemiah, what do? Rebuild walls, rebuild temple. They're the ones that, he's the one that goes and kind of petitions Cyrus, and he gives them the permission to get to come home. What are you laughing about over here? The inner nerd?
I need to put on 2 different kind of earrings.
Do you have the same color shoes on?
She's done that.
Hey, but you know what, Lori? Most of us won't see both sides of your head at one time, so as long as you just kind of stand off to the side, then we'll be all right. All right. All right. I got to try to regain my train of thought after that one. That's pretty good. That's it. That's exactly. That's where my brain went first. Was fish in the ice. That's all I could think of. Or you're not planning to bring ice to anybody. All right. There's not a potluck today. We're all safe. Yeah. All right. Anybody know what country or nation Cyrus was part of? Because this is going to come into play here in a second. He's the Persian Empire, and he's the one that, and not only does he give them permission, but doesn't he also kind of give them provisions to even be able to kind of do what they're going to do. All of that's going to come into play in the middle of this time. So Nehemiah is the last kind of historical book. Malachi is the last prophetic word. And then what I'll give you is that period falls into 4 kind of divisions. And we're going to get this to Daniel 7 and 8 here in a second. So from Nehemiah to Christ, there's kind of 4 divisions. The Persian rule is how they start. They're the ones that give them permission to go home. Interestingly, does Cyrus come up in any other book of your Bible other than Daniel? Why are you not here? Big time. In what way?
He was predicted by Isaiah.
Isaiah names him by name. God calls him his servant at least 120 to 140 years, calls him by name before he's even in the picture. And his nation is not the big dog at the time that is prophesied in the works of Isaiah. So it's a big deal that he's going to be his servant. And some people even suggest that Daniel used that prophecy to kind of try to encourage and speak to him about lots of different things there. But anyways, it's fascinating. So the Persians are there. What nation follows the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire? Greece. Who's their main guy that you would know of if you've ever watched, movies or historical things, or you remember in study? Who's the big daddy of the Greeks? Alexander the Great. And what do you guys know about him? Because this is all going to come into Daniel 7 and 8.
Conquered the civilized world. He died young.
Dies young, so he gets the work done in a short amount of time. After he dies, what kind of happens to the Greek Empire? It gets split up. You remember how he's got generals? Anybody remember how many he had? He's got 4, and they divide the territory amongst those 4. That's going to be in Daniel 7 and 8, really 8 more. Now, of those 4, the 2 that are most relevant to us in a biblical study would be the Ptolemies, who takes over Egypt, and the Seleucids, who are kind of over the region of Syria. Those 2, in fact, your Bible, and I'm not deep diving into Daniel 11, but Daniel 11, if you're a history nerd, to study the battles between the Ptolemies and the Seleucid kingdoms, and Daniel 11 is literally so precise, even without naming exact characters, that it makes modern day scholars convinced that it had to be written after the fact. There's no way that Daniel could have done this and called his shot this specifically before the fact. It's got to be written after the fact. It's a fascinating study in and of itself, but we're not going there. All right, so you've got the Persians, you've got the Greeks, and then who takes over from the Greeks? Rome does. About 63 BC is where the Romans, and so all of that is where I'm talking about. I'm really just kind of limiting our study to just what's going on with God's people in Jerusalem and Israel. Persians let them come home. The one nation from Daniel 2 that we didn't start with, who's the first one that totes them off? Babylon is actually the first one that totes them off. It's the Persians that are going to allow them to come home. Then the Greeks are going to kind of take over. And then there's some good things that come from all of that. And then you got the Romans. Man, I want to go 9,000 places at once, and I'm trying to let me get some scripture in front of you. Let's do that with a Bible study before I nerd out on all the things that I want to talk about. In Daniel 7, he has this vision. It says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. And in this vision in verse 2, the 4 winds of heaven are churning up the great sea. And in verse 3, 4 great beasts, each different from the others, come out of the sea. Right? And the first one in verse 4 is what? What's it look like? A lion, and anything else about it? Wings like an eagle, and then its wings are going to get torn off, and then it's going to kind of like stand around. If you're comparing this list, Daniel 7 to Daniel 2, y'all remember when I referenced the image of Daniel 2, do y'all immediately kind of know what I'm talking about? The idol that Nebuchadnezzar sees, it has a head made out of what metal? Head of gold, which is representative of Babylon. And then you've got the chest and arms, silver, bronze, and then iron and clay. It's the same vision of 4 kingdoms that we have here. They're parallel. Here, the lion, I believe, is a reference to Babylon. Eagle's wings is an eagle swooping down is kind of even mentioned in Jeremiah, a reference to what they were going to do when Babylon destroys Moab. So that's the first thing that he sees. The second one he sees in verse 5, what does it look like? It's a bear. Interestingly, it's raised up on one side, right? And it's got 3 ribs in its mouth, and there's different people, but like people talk about it being raised up on one side. It's the Medo-Persian Empire. Most history people don't even talk about the Medes. You pretty much go straight to the Persians, and kind of until archaeology and other finds came out about which came first and which was primary, But, it's kind of starts out blended, but the Persians really are the raised up one. People say possibly that the 3 ribs are the 3 great battles that would have happened where they conquer Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt. I don't know about all that. I'll save that for another day. The third beast in verse 6, what does it look like? A leopard. What do you know about a leopard? They kill you. Powerful. Well, and it's got 4 wings, right? And we're going to get to another one here in a second that's going to talk about when this leopard comes, its feet don't even touch the ground. He's getting there in a hurry, right? So that would be, if we're tracing 3, we've got Babylon, and then we've got Persia. And who would the leopard be? That's got to be Greece. And interestingly, 4 wings, and it's got 4 heads. That one nation's going to turn into 4. That's going to become prominent here in a second. But then the 4th one is the main one. Because in Daniel 2, it's that 4th nation that little pebble is going to strike the foot of that statue. And then that little stone becomes a kingdom that fills the whole world. What do you think Daniel 2, that little stone that strikes the base of the statue is about? What is the little stone? It's the gospel. I've heard people say Jesus. Some people might say the Christian age or the church age. When we get to Rome, that 4th kingdom, God's going to establish a kingdom, Daniel chapter 2, verses 42, 43, 44, and following, a kingdom that will last forever. We got 4 kingdoms, but when we get that one, that little church kingdom, that little pebble is going to strike that statue, and it's going to topple over, and then that little pebble becomes a mountain that fills the whole world. So it's that 4th kingdom we're interested in. Well, that 4th kingdom is pretty ferocious in what it's going to do to the church and how it will persecute. Verse 7, I looked, and before me there was a 4th beast. Do you have words like terrifying and frightening and powerful? What other words do you have? Dreadful. That's even better. Anything else? Strong and exceedingly strong. Large iron teeth. Crushed and devour its victims. Trample underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it's got 10 horns, and then a little horn comes out of that uproots 3 others. And all of that, and this is where I almost deep dove into Revelation 17 and comparing that, like, this is like playing out scriptures with the Roman emperors, that 3 get uprooted and who this one points to. There's a little bit of, whether you're an early dater or a late dater, who that 11th or who the 8th is from whatever, and I didn't go in there whether it's Titus, Domitian. A lot of it has to do with which one destroyed the temple and then wreaked the most havoc on Christians, but I did not. Be proud of me. I didn't deep dive into that. If you're interested in that, we'll have a special session some other time. Ancient of Days. He also sees the Ancient of Days on his seat. Verse 9, clothing white as snow, hair of his head white like wool, throne flaming fire, and wheels were all ablaze, a river of fire. There's a lot of similarities to what Revelation will have, but here we've got this Ancient of Days that's going on here. Also, the end of verse 10 says the court was seated and books were opened. Judgment, a reckoning, an account being taken. And he continues to watch the horn that's going to do a lot of different things. Verse 13, now there's one before me like the Son of Man. Why is that an interesting reference? What does Son of Man make you think of? That's his title that he's used multiple times. He approaches the Ancient of Days, led into his presence, and he's given authority and glory and sovereign power, and all nations and peoples of every nation and language worship him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that won't pass away. His kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. That's that Son of Man's kingdom. So he's got this picture of these nations, and we get to this dreadful one, and there's a horn that's going to raise up that's going to do awful things to God's people. But during that same time frame, if I'm doing Daniel 2, a kingdom's going to grow that can't be shaken or destroyed. Here, during that same time frame, one like the Son of Man is given the preeminence here to become, in our terminology, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And all authority, he said, what? Has been granted to me on heaven and on earth. And he's got glory and sovereign power, and every tribe, tongue, and nation are going to come to him, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And Daniel's getting to see this. Why that relates to an intertestamental period is they have to live through the coming of those beasts. And it's not all nice and cozy. Now, there are some interesting things that happen, but the fourth beast is different than the other three. We're going to find out. Cyrus and the Persians helped the God's people, made it possible for them to have permission to go home and set them up for success. I want to a little bit talk about what the Greeks do. Alexander lets the Jews set up kind of their own study and encourages the translating of the Hebrew Bible into that Koine Greek language. That's the Septuagint that we referenced last Sunday. What is the Septuagint? It is a Greek translation of your Old Testament and made it study, and Alexander actually did he encouraged study and let them have part of their own library, let them have their own language, does favors for the Jewish people, puts it in a language that we can understand and multiple people could then understand. Alexander shrinks the world, harmonizes the world, and he does that Greek culture everywhere, which also paves the way for the Romans. You made that comment, I believe, last Sunday. What the Romans do with the Roman peace and the Roman roadways, they build on what Alexander did, and it makes the world smaller. So when the gospel now travels, we've got similar languages, similar cultures, and an easy way to do it. It's kind of a big deal. Persians and the Greeks are somewhat favorable to Christians. Romans, yes and no, and then it turns really ugly towards the end.
Some of the Greeks towards the end of the Greek reign.
Well, let's say we're going to talk about the Seleucids. When Alexander does a lot, when it goes to the four generals, and then Daniel 11 is basically about it. Y'all, and this is Daniel 8, and this is other parts of Daniel 11 and 12. The abomination of desolation. Y'all studied about that much at all? That's basically, and we'll get to that here in just a second when we get to Daniel 8, about what the Seleucid kingdom does to the temple to defile it. We'll get there in just a second. Daniel gets the vision of all of this. I'm not going to deep dive into 7. Go ahead and go to chapter 8. Let's just get to that one. Now it's the third year. The first one, chapter 7, was the first year of Belshazzar. Now in chapter 8, we're the third year of Belshazzar. And now he's got another vision in verse 3 of a ram with 2 horns. And the horns were long, but what does it tell you in verse 3 about those 2 horns? One's a little longer than the other and grew up later. In the book of Daniel, you've got Darius or Darius the Mede. It's the Medes. They're the preeminent kind of leaders, but it's the Medo-Persians, and over time, the Persians, just kind of dwarf in popularity and notoriety. We're getting a hint of that. You got 2 horns, but one's bigger and grows up later. And he watched that ram charge to the west and the north and the south, and nobody could stand against it. The Persians were some bad hammer knockers when they started coming through. Although there's a movie 300 where they're not nearly as cool as they think they are. This is Sparta. I'm sorry, that's a total rabbit trail, but I can't think of the Persians without thinking that. All right. Now, while he was thinking about that ram there with the 2 horns, verse 5. Suddenly a goat pops up. Do you have any explanations about that in your version, verse 5, of what kind of goat or anything about it? You got a male goat with a prominent horn. That prominent horn, in my mind, that's Alexander. He's the main big daddy, and you'll see that play out here in just a second. It's a unigoat. But it's going to become a quad goat before it's all said and done. But it's a unicorn goat that it comes. and it charges, ferociously striking the ram, shatters its two horns, stomps it to the ground, tramples over it. Nobody can rescue the ram. Poor little ram. Right? Verse 8, the goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off. At the height of its power, well, what did we just say about Alexander? I mean, he's just conquered the world in a short amount of time, and he dies young. And in its place, what happens, verse 8? You got a great horn, and in its prime, it gets broken off, and what happens? 4 horns grow up. And then this other horn, verse 9. Out of the 4 comes this other one, which starts small, grows in power to the south and to the east. It reaches to the host of heavens. It throws some of the starry host down to earth and tramples on them. Does that sound any like the descriptions of Satan as well and other things? But he's gonna shake the heavens a little bit. He is, in verse 11, going to set himself up as a great commander. It's going to take away, verse 11. Do you have something along the lines that takes away the daily sacrifice from the Lord? And his sanctuary was thrown down. And because of the rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice are given over to this little horn. I'm going to talk about him in just a second. Verse 13, the NIV has got vision concerning the daily sacrifice. It calls it the rebellion that causes desolation. Is that where you guys have the abomination of desolation in some of your translations? In verse 13? Okay. Now, Daniel gets the interpretation. We don't have to guess at this. And starting in about verse 15, I'm going to skip down to verse 20. Verse 20 of chapter 8. The 2-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece. And the large horn between its eyes is its first king. It's Alexander. The 4 horns that replace the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. It's never the same after Alexander passes. In the latter part of the reign, you've got this wicked and fierce-looking king. And verse 25, he'll take his stand against the prince of princes, yet he will be destroyed. And I love verse 27. It says, I, Daniel, was worn out, and I lay exhausted for several. After seeing all this, we read it because it's history. We're reading it on the other side. Imagine getting this on the front side saying, oh, this is what's going to happen. Why I'm even talking about this is, we just jumped to the study of Christ. Well, there's a lot of history. And even though it's the period of silence, there's 430 years or so that God doesn't say a word. Has God not spoken? And John Henry, where are you going to go with it?
He's not silent.
Maybe he didn't say anything right then during that time period, but has God called his shot in a mighty way of, I think I might know what's about to happen. I'm in control. I'm showing you I know what's coming. And all of these things really work for his glory to ultimately get done what he wants to get done. Shrinking the world, saving his people, and allowing them to go home. And there's got to be trauma for Christ to come as the great victor and the great champion.
And even though God was silent during that period of time, the Jews were not.
That's right.
There were those deuterocanonical books. A lot of them were talking about this time frame.
That's right.
And even specifically about some of the events that we're talking about.
Well, let's talk a little bit about then this end of Daniel 8 and what happens kind of during that time frame. Like I said, I know like some of this history may be familiar to some of you maybe not as studied on it. But when Alexander's kingdom divides into the 4, 2 really matter to us. Ptolemy of Egypt and the Seleucid kingdom of Syria. And what they do is they constantly are fighting each other. And Daniel chapter 11 has this war going back and forth between the 2. And what happens, the guy's name, that if you're going to remember anything of this, is when we get to that Seleucid kingdom, Antiochus Epiphanes is the guy's name. When he gets there, he's the little horn that takes on the Prince of Peace and strikes down some stars and thinks he is the man, right? And one of the main things that he does around 167, he does away with the priesthood at the temple. He's the one that stops the daily sacrifice that the Jews were allowed to do in that area. And he offers, wasn't it it was a pig on the altar to basically say, this is what I think of you and your God and your religion. And he stops the daily sacrifice, the priesthood, and worship at the temple, which I don't want to necessarily deep dive into that other than God calls his shot about that. Hey, I'm taking that guy out. And I've got a plan, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Daniel 11. I'll take care of that guy. In fact, even Daniel 8 says it's not going to be done by human hands, even though the Maccabees, y'all, is that Judas Maccabee, the hammer, they're the ones that intertestamental period. The Catholic Bible has those extra books that even the early church did not recognize as of God or necessarily inspired, but they are valuable history that we have through some of those books. And the Maccabean revolt is part of this time period that, and Hanukkah, we could get into that and all of that. Where are you going to go?
Well, in those books that you're talking about record that Antiochus was requiring Jews to partake of that pork.
Right.
There. And the notion of a bodily resurrection is very specific there.
Okay.
And so the Hazameans are the progenitors of the Pharisees.
Mm-hmm.
They believe in a bodily resurrection. So this is pretty
It's
much
paving the way.
It's paving the way for all of this, and what you see about the difference then in the future between the Pharisees believing in resurrection and the Sadducees not.
Well, and so part of the reason why, let's go down that. Antiochus Epiphanes kind of does away with temple worship. What do the Jews turn to then for worship? Well, think about when COVID strikes and we're not coming to the building. What did a lot of us do? Start going to homes. And then maybe, especially if it's not a COVID type thing, is multiple families might start worshiping in a smaller venue. Or if, like heaven forbid you lose your church building through government oppression, we'll rent a storefront. They found this is kind of the genesis, the birth of the synagogue. Now that is its own study in as well, because some people say that goes all the way back to when they were taken off to Babylon. They could worship at the temple, but they still worship. They're still set up for 70 years' time, little schools of instruction so that their kids could be taught about Jehovah and what happened to us and whatever. So some people say that the synagogue goes all the way back to the Babylonian captivity, but for sure during this time period of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Greeks kind of taking over and stopping temple worship, well, the Jews don't stop necessarily worshiping God or teaching their kids about God or their own selves, and this gives rise to the synagogue, which gives kind of a prominent place for us in everywhere that Paul goes. Where does he go first? He'd go to the local synagogue first, to the Jew first, and some would listen as kind of the pattern. And then a lot of times they didn't want the new message and he gets kicked out. And so he would go to the Gentiles in there. It's all playing in. And so that style of worship comes into play, where Bill has taken us a little bit, the division of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And where do they come from? They don't just come out of anywhere. The Pharisees do, in a large way, restore the law of Moses. They're very serious about the law of God. And we do need to put in here that there are times where Jesus compliments the Pharisees' adherence to Scripture. It's just these they should have done without neglecting the weightier matters. And he says at one point, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, right? So it's not like all cold water on. They do care about God's law and the word of God. The Sadducees, though, are really more, they were the wealthy Jews of the area that really liked the Greek culture. See, what Alexander and others did is they didn't mind you being a Jew as they conquered lots of territories. You could still somewhat keep your native identity, but I want you Greek trained as well. I want to merge the two. I want you to imbibe Greek culture. Well, Greek culture has got a lot of immorality to it. It's got worship of different gods and what those gods do and how we please those gods, whatever. Well, the wealthy, entitled Jewish people really like the Greeks. And then when the Romans come, they're the ones that are willing to pay tribute. They're the ones that sit most of the Sanhedrin, the 70. They're the ones that occupy most of those seats. They are the aristocrats. But they deny the resurrection. They're not super spiritual in nature, even though there's kind of an outer facade of they are a religious group, but they don't really care about the seriousness of the religion. It's more a title. It's more of a position. It's not really a spiritual thing. Is that an unfair? As time goes on, it gets a lot less spiritual and a lot more about, this is where it's like, y'all, the church is not a business. The church is not a worldly kingdom. And you see that where church gets turned into that, and church titles get turned into royalty and power and man-made stuff. And we can even get away from, we'll still do church, but really this is a money-making enterprise and that's the Sadducees in my brain. The Pharisees are trying to counteract that by being serious about, we need to be serious about the law and serious about what God says, but that has its own landmines that trip us up, right? Because you can be so serious about the law and miss the one that the law is all about. So that kind of, all of that is in my brain about, that needs to be in your head of, Jesus doesn't just pop onto the screen. What happened in history? I got to think that the Daniel prophecies and the Isaiah prophecies would have been powerful to convince Jews of, look at God calling a shot. I think that would even be powerful, like if I was doing evidences and talking to my neighbor in first century, I'm talking to my Gentile or my Greek or my Roman neighbor. Hey, we've been knowing about this for a long time. We've been talking about this. This has been being taught in our little, synagogue or rabbi schools, and we're learning about the Torah and the Mishnah and all. Evidences for that of God calling a shot, I would think would be a very convincing. We know they were looking for a Messiah. We know that they knew this is the fourth kingdom. This is the great beast. It's our time. Is it now you're going to restore the kingdom? They're waiting. They're looking for, they're anxiously anticipating it. But as we've said in multiple Bible studies, they were probably looking for the wrong kind of kingdom. If I've got a Persian type kingdom, an Alexander type kingdom, and a Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, we're thinking when our champion comes, we're going to get another Alexander, a young, powerful champion. We're going to get our own Antiochus Epiphanes, but he's going to be on our side now, and we're going to whoop the other side. And we're going to drive those wicked Romans out. And then Jesus comes along and says, my kingdom's not of this world. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal. It's words. Those words, those powerful words can take down strongholds. But if my kingdom were of this world, we'd pick up swords. We would fight. But that's not what my kingdom is. And yet at the same time, Daniel 2, that kingdom that isn't going to be established by swords and by military power is going to take over the whole world in a more subtle and in a more, powerful type way. Fascinating type stuff. All right. Any other kind of thoughts like here or your just anything, takeaways or where your brain goes? And last forever. These come and go. Hebrews. We don't need a high priest multiple times. I don't need multiple kings. We've got a king who lasts forever, who lives forever, whose kingdom. Because he never dies, he doesn't ever have to give up his kingdom. Because he never dies, he never gives up his priesthood. he is priest forever, like Melchizedek, king and priest at the same time.
They didn't know what to expect when Jesus came because they didn't pay attention to the prophecies.
That's right.
If you put Isaiah and what he said in 53 with the small little,
That's right.
small little pebble taking out the whole statue,
It's going to start small
very small.
and then grow.
It didn't say some big giant, 12-horn, whatever.
That's right.
It wasn't something.
I'm not using man type power. Yes, yes. And I'm thinking like beating our swords into plows. It's not about the sword anymore. It's all right. So what I want to do for Wednesday, to give y'all time to prep, is I want to cover the 4 Gospels and how they tell the story of Jesus in their own way. So what do you know, or what can you find about the author and possibly what audience? I mean, yes, they're all for everybody, but are the Gospels nuanced, I guess would be the way of wording that. And why and how. So that's what we'll try to cover on Wednesday. And I have some reason just to screenshot.